I hardly know where to begin. Let me make a couple. First, let me clarify a bit. In talking about the quality of governance arrangements, I was simply trying to add. I wasn't trying to create an idealization of what good governance would be, but simply trying to lay out some criteria. And I wouldn't even say they're exhaustive. I would actually be interested in further feedback or critical comments of what's missing from this list of criteria. All I'm really trying to do is suggest that there can be different kinds of governance arrangements and just provide a vocabulary for looking at the quality of governance along this multi-dimensional framework. So that was my main goal. I'd like to let me actually comment directly on since he identified me, my former student, Garth Lapierre, who you heard from earlier this afternoon, a student of mine at Yale some years ago. In effect, if you ask me to apply the set of criteria to the post-war order, I'd have to first of all say, well, go back to my opening point about it wasn't a single governance system. It was a complex of different governance arrangements in different issue domains. So I'd actually have to take it apart and say, well, what exactly are you talking about? So I'd look at it in different issue domains. Then I would assess the criteria. And by some criteria, the United Nations system was a significant improvement in some ways because it was globally inclusive of the states of the day, and it showed adaptability and ability to bring on new members through the processes of decolonization. Representativeness, no, obviously not, but even the history of Security Council membership goes through interesting adaptations, because initially it was just the permanent 5. Then it was expanded to 12, then subsequently to 15. So it has gone through these different, but I would argue that you'd have to look at the different governance arrangements in different issue domains and assess them according to this or other sets of criteria. That's how I would at least respond. To Ambassador Gelson's pessimism, I guess. I would say, I don't think you were all that pessimistic. I would say that I guess I'm an incrementalist. I think I don't know how I've become this way, but it's something that if I look at how am I doing? Have I used my 5 minutes? No. There are all sorts of, first of all, my own view on the norms of Security Council reform. Yes, of course, it's unjust, it's overdue, there should be reform. I also don't think it's going to happen. It's overdetermined. The reasons why are overdetermined, and we can go through regional dynamics in many areas why. It doesn't mean, however, I don't think governance should be identified or equated with Security Council membership reform, because, in fact, as you pointed out, UN reform, that's just one part of UN reform. There also is reform of the organization, of internal practices, and I think these practices and procedures can really be quite significant. They may seem incremental and marginal and a small, but in fact they can build up over time and change the nature of how the institution operates. Since I live in the second city of the UN now, I see this in many different ways, but I would argue that rather than, just because you can't reform you can't reform the membership of the Council, doesn't mean that reforms of important institutional practices of the Council cannot be addressed. And here I would say, look at the way that the Council has accepted a review mechanism at the UN level to investigate its decision-making with regard to designations made to individuals by Security Council committees. This is the first time the Council has ever accepted the idea at the UN level that it doesn't have authority to overturn the Council, but it's an ombudsperson, an office of an ombudsperson who receives petitions from individuals who have been designated and basically significantly contributes to due process. It's not a perfect system. There are still flaws. It's not legal. I can go on many, but nonetheless, it's a significant development. I would also argue that the role of and here's where I go back to the points I didn't make in my presentation. Where did this pressure come from? Well, it came from a group of so-called like-minded states not permanent members of the Security Council, who actually push the issue consistently through a wide variety of fora and actually have managed to push this kind of reform step by step. Another example of I think, potentially very significant, and this goes to the nuclear issue, incrementalism, is the recent challenge by the Mexican foreign minister, I believe a graduate of the Graduate Institute, I might add, at the Cancun Environmental Conference on the principle of consensus. That is the idea that unanimity of all UN General Assembly action, something that in effect gives every member state a unit veto. Her decision to overrule the objections of her Bolivian counterpart on the basis of overwhelming support for the final resolution really sent ripples through the organization. And I can assure you that people at the Disarmament Conference in Geneva certainly took note of this, because the entire agenda of the Disarmament Conference is being held up by a single country, largely because of its regional security dynamics and concerns, Pakistan. So these are examples that institutions can be reformed without sweeping constitutional change at the top. That's my point of optimism, I guess, on this point. I'd love to talk. I have lots of. I'd like to talk more about the Brazil-Turkey proposal. Iran is one of the cases that we've been looking at quite closely in our comparative analysis of UN Security Council resolutions. It wasn't just the U.S. that was concerned. It was Russia. Some of the strongest objections came from the Russian ambassador, and part of it was just, look, don't mess with the P5. We know what we're doing. It was more than that, however. It was also technical concerns that, although the elements of the IAEA report would have been satisfied, it created and left significant loopholes that several P5 members thought would allow Iran to continue to weaponize nuclear weapons, and therefore it was unwise. They also had a political consensus around a new resolution at the moment, so the timing wasn't, in a sense, ideal. But I'm sure there's much debate, and I'm sure there's been a lot of debate here about it. And I had some other comments, but I think, was there anything else I really wanted to say? No, I'll stop at this point. Thank
you. I'll try not to take very long. Obviously, one of the things that I was not saying, but that I hope came across, was that I'm in general uncomfortable with the idea of talking about states as unitary objects. I mean, it's a familiar critique and one that you all know too well. The difficulty, of course, is then how to actually conceptualize it in a way that allows us to reflect and recognize the ability of groups within, whether interest groups or civil society groups, to shape state power in some way and yet be able to talk about international relations, right? So we've got a kind of multi-level situation that we've got to address. So part of what the presentation was about was actually trying to be explicit about that and ask, in a sense, what does international politics look like when domestic factors in civil society as well as the state are actors playing some role or the other. So that's by way of kind of a methodological comment which addresses, I think, in some respects, some of certainly the question, I think, about citizenship, put in a somewhat slightly different context. I want to think about Ratan's comment about all these countries have particular ways of dealing with the United States and tying that in with the nuclear question. I mean, it has to be remembered that India's relationship with the United States is generally accepted to be quite bad from the late 60s well into towards the end of the Cold War. And what changes American policy towards India, it's unfortunately easy to say, is the 1998 set of nuclear explosions. So what this says about India, we can talk about later, but what this says about the United States as the hegemon of the system is that that's the way to get the US's attention, right? And that's been repeated time and time again in different forums and settings, whether truthfully or not so truthfully, as in the case of Iraq. So in a sense, we've got an overdetermined situation when we're talking about the United Nations and international security in relation to this question of nuclear weapons. In that context, the Turkish-Brazilian proposal to me is exactly the kind of direction that we need to be thinking about, because when it comes to the P5 and the US in particular, it only has one response to the question of proliferation. So we should have another conference on proliferation and what we all think of that, but let me say that for me it's political language. I'm not in favor of nuclear weapons at all, and I would like to see India get rid of it. But I also have to accept that in the current context, in the last 50 years, what we call proliferation isn't simply the acquisition of nuclear weapons by different states, but equally the effort by different states to prevent other countries from getting nuclear weapons because they're valuable. Right? We've got to see it from both sides simultaneously, and then we can talk about that thing called proliferation. So what seemed to me good about the Turkish-Brazilian proposal, and I don't know it in enough detail, would seem to me that it cut across, in a sense, some of those issues. Last comment, and this confirmed where I began, this question of Bandung and its kind of imagined memory being so powerful. Why do so many people think that Nkrumah came to Bandung? He didn't. Why do people think Ben Bella came to Bandung? He didn't. Nasser himself barely said 10 words through the entire conference. I mean, even though it's an Afro-Asian conference, there were very few participants from Africa, and those that were there hardly participated. So in that sense, the memory of Bandung is far more critical and important and meaningful than what actually happened at the event itself, which is why I think it's important for us to go back to the event and draw a different set of lessons without undermining the importance of it as a symbolic event. That allows me then, I think, to come to the last issue that perhaps again is worthy of a whole discussion in itself, about iconic figures, about great men coming out of the third world. I'll just say this. I mean, I think Lula is probably one of the most charismatic politicians in the world today. Of course, he's an ex-politician, but you know what I mean. But I think more important than that is the comment that was made to me by Radhika Kumaraswamy, who some of you may know, who's a UN official now, but at that time was a human rights lawyer in Sri Lanka, whose father was a member of the Ceylonese delegation to the Bandung conference. So I'd come back from doing all my Bandung research, and there was a huge set of photographs of all the people who were there. So I go to Colombo and I meet Radhika and I say, Radhika, your father was at Bandung. What do you think about it? And I expected a kind of a gushy, oh, it was such a wonderful moment, that's when this happened. She said that's when patriarchy integrated with national security to create the nation state that we're struggling against today. She's a feminist, as you might have guessed. But more than that, I think I'm also trying to point to Bandung as being a moment at which the nation-state form, as we know it today, gets consolidated. Now, there's a number of ways in which to read that. It's opening up, I know, a number of different doors. But I think that what Radhika's lack of nostalgia for that moment we should read today as being when a certain set of political options gets closed off, a certain meaning of majority and minority gets fixed, a certain territorial form gets hegemonized, and the guys who represented the Nehrus and the Nassers and the Sukarnos and UNU from Burma, who remembers him, their conversation, in a sense, was a conversation that belongs, I think, to a certain place and of a certain time. I'm not sure that's the conversation we want to valorize for our times today, even as I think we lack heroes, heroines, in the global south today. And that's something that we should all, what can we say, yeah, I'll stop there before I say something silly. So. Mandela.
Obrigado. Eu vou tratar de alguns pontos que foram levantados nas perguntas, começando pela pergunta, ou pelo menos o ponto feito pelo Ratin Roy, em relação a países que aspiram à participação permanente no Conselho de Segurança terem uma atitude assertiva em relação à questão de candidaturas. Acho que aí, no caso, é importante ter a atitude assertiva, independentemente de ser ou não candidato, porque aí digamos assim, é a expressão do interesse. É preciso dizer por que um país está interessado no caso aí, numa candidatura de alto perfil. O ponto que eu faria aí é que, pela proposta dos países em desenvolvimento em geral, tanto da Índia, Brasil, como também no caso africano, é que novos membros permanentes sejam eleitos pela Assembleia Geral. De forma que isso já daria a esses eventuais novos membros permanentes uma característica muito diferente dos atuais, que são, digamos assim, quase que por direito divino. membros permanentes, nesse caso dos países que aspiram a essa permanência, seria através de um processo na Assembleia Geral. Porque por mais que, aí no caso, o próprio presidente Obama apoie a candidatura da Índia explicitamente e diga que aprecia o Brasil como possível membro permanente, mas isso não, quer dizer, não é uma questão que vai se resolver dessa forma. É preciso que haja um processo nas Nações Unidas e essa permanência decorreria de uma decisão democrática da Assembleia Geral. Então isso já daria a esses países uma necessidade de, digamos, responder àqueles que os elegeram. De maneira que aí haveria, eu acho que é importante ter presente essa distinção. Depois, bom, eu não vou me furtar também a fazer algum comentário sobre essa pergunta do Milani, embora seja um tema realmente muito polêmico, essa questão da atuação do Brasil e da Turquia, na época como 2 membros do Conselho de Segurança, na questão nuclear iraniana. E aí, o ponto que eu faria é que essa foi uma medida, na verdade, de fortalecimento da confiança, e não propriamente de desarmamento nuclear, porque não havia, quer dizer, isso não se caracterizaria como uma medida de desarmamento nuclear, e sim de fortalecimento da confiança, na verdade, trabalhando com base numa proposta que tinha sido feita pelos próprios países nucleares ao Irã, em matéria de procurar, digamos assim, mitigar a preocupação que havia em relação à capacidade de enriquecimento de urânio por parte do Irã, e quem ficaria com a custódia desse urânio durante um certo período. Foi isso que essa é uma proposta, claro, que tem uma série de questões técnicas e é muito instrumentalizada politicamente, e foi muito, e ainda é, de maneira que, mas enfim, mas a questão em si é uma questão de fortalecimento da confiança. E aí a gente viu, Thomas falou aí sobre a atitude dos membros permanentes, talvez tenha havido um pouco essa atitude de não querer aceitar muito esse tipo de atuação por parte desses 2 países. Também havia um elemento aí de interesse de aprovar sanções sobre o Irã, que também eu acho que pesou. Mas, enfim, isso não retira o mérito da tentativa de justamente fazer valer algo que, na verdade, não veio nem desses 2 países, Brasil e Turquia, já estava na mesa. Mas, enfim, de fazer o Irã, no caso aí, aceitar uma modalidade de fortalecimento da confiança. Pergunta também o ponto levantado pela Mônica Rist sobre a questão dos países que contribuem tropas. É verdade, tem muito mais, ou seja, o número de países, eu não tenho aqui os dados exatos, mas é em torno de 80% ou mais de contingentes que vêm de países em desenvolvimento. E, bom, claro, aí há de fato uma desproporção. E o financiamento das operações de paz recai principalmente sobre os membros permanentes do Conselho de Segurança. Há uma escala de cálculo diferenciada, e isso é uma questão que se coloca também quando, enfim, se discute a questão da expansão do Conselho de Segurança, quem pagaria, até que ponto ingressar como membro permanente também significa um aumento da contribuição financeira, além, no caso de um país em desenvolvimento, como a Índia ou outro país, a sua contribuição em contingentes. O ponto que eu faria aqui é que os países, os grandes contribuintes de tropas, têm tido uma representação política diferenciada numa comissão, a Comissão de Construção da Paz das Nações Unidas, que é uma comissão nova, criada há uns 5 anos atrás, que trata justamente do pós-conflito e de como garantir, ou pelo menos procurar assegurar que um país que sofreu conflito não vai recair em conflito depois que a operação, digamos assim, de paz das Nações Unidas deixe o país. De maneira que, embora seja verdade e tenham muito mais contingentes de países em desenvolvimento, eles também estão encontrando maneiras pelo menos de ter uma representação um pouco diferenciada. E eu diria especificamente nessa comissão de consolidação da paz. O último ponto da Letícia Pinheiro em relação a questão que, na verdade, foi também tratado pelo embaixador Gelson, que eu achei um ponto muito, muito pertinente, que é justamente ele deu o exemplo da AIDS, desse programa, mas aí o que eu diria é que aí sim, realmente há um escopo de cooperação muito, muito significativo entre países como o Brasil, Índia, África do Sul e outros, porque são países que, embora países em desenvolvimento, já são capazes de desenvolver maneiras e métodos e programas para tratar de questões do desenvolvimento em si. e formas viáveis de aplicação. Quer dizer, no caso da AIDS não é exatamente um problema apenas do desenvolvimento, mas o enfoque foi. E foi um enfoque que justamente se aplicava a um país que tem muita gente pobre com AIDS, claro. Mas isso também acontece em casos, por exemplo, de redução, programas de redução da violência. Isso é uma coisa muito própria de países em desenvolvimento, em que, claro, aí é um grande escopo de cooperação, porque o tipo de ação de países desenvolvidos nessa área é diferente, porque são realidades diferentes. Ou então de redução claro, obviamente, redução da pobreza ou de combate à fome. São programas que foram desenvolvidos nesses países e que podem ser reproduzidos não só nesses outros, aqui a gente mencionou os países, enfim, de maior expressão no mundo em desenvolvimento, mas também da cooperação desses países com outros países em desenvolvimento. E isso é algo, digamos, realmente novo. Até certo ponto não era possível que países como os nossos conseguissem desenvolver isso talvez há 10 ou há 20 anos atrás. São esses pontos que eu queria fazer. Muito obrigado.
Eu queria agradecer muito, especialmente aos expositores, aos debatedores, à plateia, e lembrar que amanhã a gente retoma às 9h30, exatamente com o tema que o embaixador avançou, que é o tema dos desafios da cooperação para o desenvolvimento. Muito obrigada, boa tarde.